Hey there, lovely soul. Welcome back to Noah's Stories. How have you been? Have you been nurturing your dreams lately? Today's story delves into themes of healing, responsibility, and the courage to love, even when it's daunting. Ava Mitchell, a dynamic creative director in high fashion, and Tom Callahan, a stoic and calculated CEO, both epitomize success and emotional fortitude. However, an unforeseen night, unplanned and unspoken, initiates a journey neither anticipated, a journey that won't just reshape their futures, but force them to face who they really are. So, take a moment with me. Let me tell you a story, one that began not with love, not even with hope, but with one quiet, unexpected night. It was celebration night at Mason Vera, a luxury fashion powerhouse based in Chicago. The company had just smashed sales records nationwide thanks to its latest campaign, The Real Shape, led by none other than Ava Mitchell. At 27, she wasn't just the youngest creative director in the firm's history, she was the one rewriting the rules. Everyone around her celebrated with laughter, music, champagne, but Ava, in a deep sapphire satin gown, quietly stood by the towering windows of the 42nd floor, watching the city glow. The skyline sparkled like gold dust, a million stories unfolding below her feet. And yet, her own heart felt still. Maybe success didn't always silence the ache. "Quite the view," came a low voice behind her. Tom Callahan, the man behind the empire, 36 sharp, strategic, untouchable, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. He wore his power like a tailored suit, perfectly fitted and impossible to miss. "Congratulations," he said simply, no charm, no flattery, just truth. They stood in silence for a moment, and then they talked. At first about work, numbers, projections, campaign reach, but slowly the conversation slipped into something softer. She told him about her mother, a nurse who raised her alone, working double shifts just to make rent, yet never once forgot to show love. He paused, then spoke about his father, strict, unbending, obsessed with legacy, a man who called vulnerability weakness. And his mother? She was quiet, he said, and eventually she disappeared into her silence. There was no music, no flickering candlelight, just a shared bottle of wine and two people sitting on a leather couch as if it were neutral ground, talking, listening, slowly unraveling. And then, a kiss. Soft, slow, and then everything else stopped. Not out of passion, not out of romance, but because in that moment they weren't CEO and director. They were just two tired souls, no longer willing to face the night alone. Some truths don't need to be shouted. Two faint pink lines sufficed to upend Ava Mitchell's sense of control. 6 weeks after that night, she sat curled on the cool tile floor of her River North apartment bathroom. The third pregnancy test lay in her trembling hands. All three said the same thing: positive. The kind of positive that flips your life upside down. She stared at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the poised, unshakable Ava the world knew. Her curls were undone, her lips pale, eyes wide with fear. "Mitchell women don't break," she whispered to her reflection. "We bend, then we rise." Her mother had raised her alone while working night shifts as a nurse. She taught Ava that survival wasn't about strength, it was about choosing to keep going even when everything inside you wanted to stop. So, Ava stood up, wiped her face, put on a flawless navy pantsuit, and went to work. At the office, she functioned like clockwork. Meetings, presentations, emails. But the nausea was getting worse. And every time she passed Tom Callahan in the hallway, her stomach twisted, not from the baby, but from everything unspoken between them. They hadn't spoken about that night, not once. Until Monday morning, after a long, draining strategy session, Tom said, "Mitchell, a word in my office." Her heart skipped, her fingers clenched around the file folder, but she followed him in, head held high. He didn't look up as he typed on his laptop. She stood, waiting, the tension thick. He began to speak, but she beat him to it. "I'm pregnant." Flat, direct, like ripping off a bandage. His fingers froze. He finally looked at her. Really looked. "Are you sure?" "3 tests, I'll confirm with the doctor." Silence fell heavy between them. He leaned back, folding his hands. "What do you want?" It wasn't curiosity, it was caution. Ava's blood went cold. "Excuse me? Money? Support? A promotion? Just tell me." It wasn't his words that broke her. It was his tone, like she was a crisis he needed to contain. She stood, fire in her eyes, voice barely steady. "I don't want your money, Tom. I don't want anything. I just thought you deserve to know." Then she turned and walked out, her steps steady. Her heart? Not so much. Tom Callahan prided himself on maintaining unwavering control over numbers, people, and outcomes. Even emotions, to him, were variables to be managed. In his world, feelings were luxuries, distractions, weaknesses. But that morning after Ava had left his office with those quiet, cutting words, "I just thought, you deserved to know." Tom sat still, unable to move. He didn't chase after her, didn't say a word. He just stayed there. In an office bathed in morning light that suddenly felt colder than ever. Ava walked quickly down the hallway, her heart pounding, but she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had long stopped placing hope in men like Tom. She hadn't expected him to stop her, hadn't expected an apology. She didn't even need him to care. But what hurt was the way he looked at her, like she was a glitch in his perfect system. That afternoon, Ava submitted a formal request to transfer to the company's California office. She wasn't quitting, she wasn't running. She simply wanted to become a mother, without judgmental stares, without unanswered silence, without a man who couldn't show up but still tried to control things from a distance. 1 week later, Tom called her into his office again. "I received your transfer request," he said. "I'll start handing over my projects this week," Ava replied calmly. He nodded, but something had shifted in his expression. It wasn't cold. It wasn't soft either. It was conflicted. "Why are you leaving?" he asked, more gently this time. "Because I need space," she answered, "and because I don't want my child to grow up with a father who isn't present but still wants control." He said nothing. Ava stood to leave, but halfway to the door, she turned back. "You know, Tom," she said, voice steady, "I once thought, maybe underneath all that ice, you were a good man." He looked up, "But maybe I was wrong." Her voice didn't accuse, it didn't blame. It was just disappointment. Raw, quiet, real. "But that's okay," she added, her eyes calm. "I grew up with an amazing mother. I didn't need a father to become who I am. And neither will my child." Then she walked out, no shaking hands, no hesitation, and Tom, for the first time in years, felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of loss. Not because he was losing a brilliant employee, but because a woman who once believed in something good inside him no longer did. Some shocks don't come from loud explosions or dramatic confrontations. They come from silence. The kind of silence someone leaves behind when they walk out of your life. For Tom Callahan, that silence carried Ava Mitchell's name. After she walked out of his office with those quiet but piercing words, "I just thought you deserved to know," Tom was no longer the same. On the surface, he remained the perfect CEO, punctual, composed, sharp as ever, but at night he couldn't sleep. Instead, he sat alone in his downtown penthouse, reading article after article on pregnancy, development stages, symptoms, timelines. He didn't fully understand why he was doing it. All he knew was that he didn't want to repeat the pattern of his father. Tom's childhood was made of long, suffocating silences. His father, a respected lawyer, treated emotions like a disease. In their house, achievement was the only form of love. His mother, she was always there, physically, but emotionally she had long disappeared. Her quietness built a wall that Tom carried into every adult relationship. He had never told anyone this, not until his first session with a therapist. When the doctor asked him why he came, his answer was short but honest. I don't want to become him. From that moment on, Tom began to learn from scratch how to sit with uncomfortable feelings, how to recognize pain without running from it, how to see that control wasn't strength. Sometimes it was just fear wearing a tie. One late night, after wrestling with himself, he sent Ava an email. It read, "I'm trying to change, not for anyone else, but because I don't want to hurt anyone again. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but if you're willing, I'd like to learn how to show up." There was no reply. But the next day, Ava accepted a coffee invitation from him, just a quiet cafe in a quiet neighborhood. Not to start over, but to see if the man who disappointed her was truly trying to be better. Tom arrived early. He ordered ginger tea and plain crackers, because one article mentioned it might help with morning sickness. When Ava walked in, her eyes were guarded, but when she saw the tea and the tiny plate of crackers waiting for her, something in her expression softened, just a little. They didn't talk about that night. They didn't bring up the hurt. Instead, they talked about her OBGYN, about birth plans, about what it felt like to realize there's a heartbeat growing inside you. Tom didn't pretend to understand. He didn't try to fix anything. He just listened. And for Ava, in that moment, a man who could simply listen without trying to control, without hiding behind logic, was already a small beginning. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, but something real. Neither of them expected the storm to hit so soon, loud, brutal, and without warning. Just days after their quiet meeting at the corner cafe, Ava was packing up her office, preparing for her upcoming transfer to California, when Olivia, her closest colleague, burst in with a look of panic on her face. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, holding up her phone. The headline blared across the screen. "Maison Vera CEO in alleged affair with subordinate, stock drops amid scandal." Ava froze. The article didn't just mention her and Tom. It painted a narrative suggesting the pregnancy was the result of a backroom deal. It called her a manipulator, accused her of trading intimacy for influence. Even her transfer was twisted into a strategic retreat to dodge consequences. The cold cruelty of those words cut deep into her pride, into her identity as a woman who'd fought for everything she had. Her phone lit up with messages, calls, and anonymous comments flooding her inbox. But Ava didn't cry. She straightened her blouse, took a deep breath, and walked toward Tom's office, knowing exactly what waited for her on the other side. Inside, Tom was in a meeting with legal and PR teams. His face darkened when he saw her. "I'm sorry," he said softly, and for the first time his voice carried no command, only regret. The PR spokesperson was preparing a press statement. "We'll deny everything," she explained. "Say the relationship never existed, that the transfer was entirely personal." But before Ava could respond, Tom stood. His voice wasn't angry, it was resolute. "No, we're not lying, we're not hiding, and we're certainly not going to let anyone shame the mother of my child." The room went still. Then he turned to Ava. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't see fear of public fallout. She saw protection, sincerity, a man standing beside her, not above her. 1 hour later, at an emergency board meeting, Ava sat beside Tom. He didn't flinch, didn't deflect. He looked the board straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I'm the father of Ava's child, and no, she did not need favors or leverage to earn her place in this company. Ava Mitchell is one of the most capable professionals I've ever worked with, and the first person who's ever made me question the kind of man I want to be." The room fell into stunned silence. Then, unexpectedly, the CFO, usually the quietest person in the room, spoke up. "We stand by your decision," he said. One by one, heads nodded around the table. That afternoon, Ava didn't walk out of that boardroom as the center of a scandal. She walked out as a woman who had defended her dignity and kept her ground in the eye of the storm. And Tom Callahan, the man who once lived only for control and image, had done something he never imagined. He chose the truth, he chose her, he chose their child. 3 days before her scheduled move to California, just as Ava thought things were finally settling after the media storm, her body sent a different message. A sudden wave of dizziness hit in the middle of a Zoom meeting with her future team. Her screen blurred, the voices faded, and the next thing she remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, an IV in her arm, and a doctor speaking in a voice both calm and firm. "Your blood pressure spiked too quickly. We need to monitor you closely. Travel should be avoided for now." Ava nodded, holding back tears, not from fear, but exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've tried to be strong for too long. She clutched the freshly printed ultrasound photo the nurse had left on her bedside table where that tiny heartbeat still pulsed strong, and whispered, barely audible, "Please stay safe, little one." Tom didn't hear about it through a medical update. He heard it from Charlotte, his younger sister, who called him at 5 a.m. while he was reviewing quarterly projections. "You should know," she said without preamble. "Ava was admitted last night, alone." The last word hit like a slap. He didn't hesitate. He dropped everything. No logistics, no strategy, just instinct. For the first time, Tom wasn't the calculated CEO. He was simply a man who knew he couldn't bear the thought of repeating his father's absence. Not this time. 3 hours later, Tom arrived at the hospital, still in his suit, hair tousled from a rushed flight. When he stepped into the room, Ava was sitting upright against her pillows, clearly startled. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Being here," he replied softly. "No explanations, no agenda, just presence." As the nurse came in to recheck her vitals, Tom stayed quietly beside her. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He just held her hand, gently, warmly, genuinely. For the first time in weeks, Ava didn't feel the need to be composed or strong. She wasn't a director or a strategist. She was simply a woman, scared and tired, and the man she once thought incapable of softness was right there, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to be. After the checkup, they sat in silence, bathed in the soft glow of the hospital light. Then Tom turned to her and said quietly, "This time, I'm not running, and if you'll let me, I'll stay, for as long as it takes." Ava looked at him for a long time, not to search for an answer, but to read his face. And what she saw wasn't the cold, impenetrable CEO. It was a man, still learning, still flawed, trying, honestly, to love in the only way he knew how. And for the first time in months, she nodded. Not because she had forgotten, not because she had forgiven, but because something real was beginning to change. 2 months after the night Ava was hospitalized, winter finally began to loosen its grip on Chicago. Spring crept in quietly, soft light through windows, gentler winds, and a sense of something quietly shifting. Life hadn't changed overnight, but something between Ava and Tom had. They didn't talk about us, didn't rush to name anything, but Tom stayed. He didn't ask what she needed, he simply started doing. Bottles washed, blood pressure tracked, sitting beside her during checkups, saying nothing, just being there. And then, on an early March morning while the city still slept under a blanket of fog, their daughter arrived. Following over 8 grueling hours of labor, Ava was rewarded with the sweetest sound. Her baby girl's inaugural cry. Tom stood beside her, his gloved hands trembling, eyes wide and shining with something he didn't have a name for, something like awe. The doctor placed the baby in his arms first. She was tiny, flushed, eyes still closed, but her fingers wrapped around his the moment she touched him, as if to say, "I know you're here." Tom froze, not in fear but in complete surrender. For the first time in his life, the world didn't revolve around him. He was just a man, holding something more important than anything he'd ever built. When he passed the baby to Ava, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes met, and tears filled them both. Quiet, warm, real. "She's beautiful," Ava whispered, her fingers brushing her daughter's cheek. "Her name is Sophie." "Sophie Callahan Mitchell," Tom repeated, tasting the name like a promise, a new beginning. Ava's recovery was slow. Tom didn't leave, not because he had to, but because something in him wouldn't let him be anywhere else. He changed diapers, learned to swaddle, took shifts holding Sophie while Ava slept. Sometimes he just sat quietly by the crib, listening to her breath and letting his world grow still for the first time. Ava didn't speak of the future. She didn't need to. There was still space between them, but something had softened. Each time she saw Tom hold their daughter, with clumsy hands and reverent care, something inside her softened too. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was trust. And for her, trust was everything. When they left the hospital, they didn't walk out hand in hand. They didn't kiss, but they walked side by side, like two people willing to try. Not for romance, not for the picture-perfect ending, but for a little girl with sleepy eyes and a name that meant clarity. Without rings or grand vows, a shared glance conveyed, "We'll embark on this journey, not flawlessly, but with all the goodness we possess." Thank you for staying till the end. If this story moves something inside you, let us know in the comments. And remember, love doesn't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes it starts with a whisper.